Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Slash Film Daily. On today's show, we're going to have a feature discussion trying to figure out the answer to the age-old question, why do video game movies usually suck, and what can Hollywood do to break this curse? This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta, and joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Managing Editor Jacob Hall.
Hello, hello.
And writer Hoai-Tran Bui.
Hey, everyone.
And we have a special guest. We have a director, the director of 10 Cloverfield Lane, Dan Trachtenberg.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yes. You know, we're not used to having guests in Slash Film Daily, but with this topic, the video game movie topic, I thought if we're going to have a guest, there's no better person to have than Dan Trachtenberg, because for those of you who don't know, he's a big gamer. He started out his career as a host on the Totally Rad Show alongside Jeff Kanata, who is now host of the Slash Film Cast. The short film that got you noticed by Hollywood was based on the video game Portal, and obviously 10 Cloverfield Lane, highly influenced by video games, and your Black Mirror episode, Playtest, obviously has that video game connection. So I think you're a good guy to have on for this discussion. Let's start off by what is your experience with video game movies, Dan? Like, do they all suck?
I don't think they all suck, but there hasn't been a Wonder Woman, a Black Panther, or Dark Knight, a really breakthrough, or even not even to go that deep, but even like Iron Man or Spider-Man, or there hasn't been a that for the genre. The weird thing is even say the genre, because they all can fit into any genre. That might even be something that makes it unique and interesting to talk about, because it's not like the superheroes are their own genre, and westerns are their own genre, and horror films are their own genre, and video game movies have been adventure movies, have been horror films, have been martial arts movies. They've been whatever, because they are a medium unto their own. So my experience has, first of all, I like the Super Mario Brothers movie. I am one of the few people that do, and I think that it actually is interesting to bring up and talking about video game adaptations, not just I think everyone goes to it for the look at how bad that original one was. But it actually does a lot of things. In many ways, it's not that dissimilar to The Dark Knight. Cinematographically, it's actually pretty modern. That and the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie are shot in this very grounded and gritty way that we are now more accustomed to, and it looks more like a modern movie than it does look like a 90s movie. So that's interesting. And the other thing was just the way that it radically interpreted the source material, which I think was the right call. I think it ultimately could have. I think that's a tough movie to make live action, and I imagine if someone were to crack a Super Mario Brothers movie, it would probably be animated.
Guys that did Despicable Me are now currently making an animated version.
There you go, and it very well may be rad. But I think interpreting like there being another world where there are lizard men, and jump boots for the jumping. I think there's some interesting choices that could have been fine if it was executed really well and didn't make other choices that were bizarre and weird. But also, if that kind of thing came out today, I think it might be more warmly received than it had. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that movie because most people think it's absolutely abysmal.
So is that your favorite video game movie?
I have not seen Tomb Raider, and I hear that it's awesome, or not. I've heard mixed reviews, but I have heard from some that it's awesome, which I've never heard a video game movie described before. I remember enjoying the Resident Evil movie, and I think there's very cool parts in it, in that first Resident Evil movie. I think Silent Hill is very interestingly imagined, has some great imagery as well, and is a haunting tale. And Mortal Kombat, I think, was the most left the strongest impression on me. I remember that being a very big deal before it came out. I remember it doing well. And there were some very martial arts fight sequences had not been portrayed in American cinema the way that they had in that movie. Staging in wide shots and really well done choreography. So I do remember being impressed with that movie, though I'm sure if I were to revisit it, it would not be great. But that's my. So I feel like maybe I'm missing. Am I missing any guys? Is there any that are worth talking about that came close to being something that I've not mentioned?
Well, I can personally vouch for the new Tomb Raider. I think it's pretty good. I wouldn't say awesome, but it does a really good job of taking what made the new games work, which is the less super heroic Lara Croft, and running with that in a way that actually functions as a proper movie while also reflecting why people have embraced the new games. So while I don't think it's a great movie, I think that it definitely belongs in the conversation of the better ones.
Right.
Yeah, I've seen the new Tomb Raider. I haven't played any of the games, but I will say it's probably the best experience I've had watching a video game movie, just because it made me really want to play the video game. I saw a lot of aspects in there, like the puzzle solving things and all of like the kind of missions and games in there that were really interesting to me, and that sort of elevated the middling action movie events that were happening in it. But yeah, it was interesting to me because it was like the parts that felt the most gamey that really appealed to me more than like the story itself or the film itself.
It's interesting.
For me, Dan knows I'm not a big video gamer. I'm kind of a retro gamer. I liked NES and Super NES and that kind of era of gaming, before HT was born. And don't
say that.
And
not that young.
Not that young. Okay. I don't know. I feel like for the best video game movie, like Silent Hill was the most interesting to me, but I don't really have like a love for it. I feel like there's a genre of movies that I like to call video game movies that were not based on video games that I feel like I have more of affinity for, like Scott Pilgrim, the new Jumanji, Wreck-It Ralph, Edge of Tomorrow, the Crank films. Like I feel like those capture kind of video games, but without being a video game adaptation.
I think they're kind of illegal for this conversation, but I hear you.
Okay, so
I also like Hardcore Henry, right? Or I feel like there was one even more recently that I did not see, but I remember people I guess it was Jumanji. But I think that those are. I mean, it's the same. I would also. For me, I made Cloverfield Lane very much inspired by my video game experiences, but I don't think anyone's going to consider that
there's definitely moments in there that you can definitely feel were inspired by video games. But bringing up these movies, these video game movies that are not video game movies, I think those are examples of stories that could very well have been video games, but aren't. And they're good movies. So why is it that movies that are based on a video game property can't, like, have not yet been adapted into a good movie? Like, why do you think?
Well, first of all, I think it's worthy to set the table for this discussion, in bringing up, video games in earnest became experiences that we have a fondness for in the probably late 70s, early 80s. It's Atari and Nintendo, I think, and are the first times that we could think this outside of Pong and Pac-Man, although I guess you could consider Pac-Man something that could be adapted at some point. But so that's 80s, 1980, let's say, to now is how many years? I don't even know.
It's 37.
It's my age. It's 30. Yeah, exactly. Okay, it's 37 years. And comics have started when? When was the first comic book? Like 30s, I would say? Or when was Superman? Action Comics #1 is
Jacob must know this.
I want to say 38. It was definitely late 30s.
Okay, and when was the first great comic book movie adaptation?
Probably 2002 with Spider-Man.
Well, no, I would say Superman the movie.
What about the first Superman movie?
Oh, you know what? You are right, because there's a 30-year gap between the good ones, but you're right.
Well, that's also worth noting, right? So it took that long till we had our first great comic book adaptation, and then even after that, there was a lot of schlock, and then we got into this little renaissance we're in. And I want to also point out that there's way more bad book adaptations, way more bad magazine article adaptations, and there's
also way more of those.
Of them.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. But that's worth pointing out, is that we just don't have a lot of movies to consider. There haven't been that many attempts, and the attempts that were made have not been great so far. And that is not much unlike, it's hard for any millennial to think of superheroes ever being not what they are now, but there was a very long time when they weren't. And then even after they got good for a second, then they weren't anymore. And then they got good again, and then they weren't anymore, and now they're good. So it took a lot of at-bats to make it, and we just have not had very many at-bats for video games. And I think we're on the cusp now, because now a lot of people that have grown up with video games are now in the position to be adapting them. But the thing that I find to be very tricky is that, unfortunately, a lot of the games that we grew up on in the 80s were great games, but not great stories. And those, I think, would have been more exciting to adapt because they're so different, and the adaptation could be so much more unique and different than the game experience. Now, our games have gotten so great. They've become these incredible storytelling experiences that the movie can only pale in comparison to the game. So we missed a really delicious window that I wish could have been taken advantage of.
Well, you know what you're saying here. I want to lead into a clip I have. It's an interview clip when I was talking to Jordan Vogt-Roberts about Kong Skull Island. So it was recorded last year, and he's developing a Metal Gear Solid movie with Kojima, and listen to this clip. And I love that shot with the helicopters going the 360 through.
Yeah, I mean,
this omnipresent.
Yes,
idea.
Video games. That's a very video game shot to me. That shot actually was inspired by a cinematic in a Resident Evil game. The stamp on this movie of video games and anime is massive. That is my childhood. That is my DNA. And so. The influences of Shadow of the Colossus on this movie are massive in terms of the feeling of these sort of like lonely, towering, lumbering gods. But there was I think video games rewired my brain. I think there's a handful of directors now coming up, guys like Trachtenberg, who we were so raised on video games, but also had a love of film. And so, I think normally being like, oh, it's got like video game influences for a lot of people would be a very negative thing. But in fact, I think one of the best things about 10 Cloverfield Lane, when you look at it, is there are like these video game inspired ways of conveying information and moving the camera. And so the video game influences on this movie are like endless and enormous.
Why do most video game movies suck?
Because, I think that most filmmakers who have tried to adapt them, much like there was not a good comic book movie for a long time, and then it took directors who had grew up with comic book influences to, like Sam Raimi legitimately loved Spider-Man, right? So it took guys who grew up with comic book influences and were good filmmakers to tackle that. I think that like you've got guys like Trachtenberg and a handful of people like me now who are growing up having our brains rewired by Zelda and Metroid, and because there's a logic to video games, right? There's a language to them, and I don't think that there's been a wave of directors who have come up who are filmmakers who were rewired like that, and I think that they fundamentally don't understand the difference between an active experience and a passive experience, and how you translate a active experience into a compelling passive experience, because there are things that you can get away with in an active experience in a video game that would not fly in a movie. in terms of storytelling, in terms of a lot of different things, in terms of characters, in terms of set pieces. There are things that when you take out the active experience, suddenly it's not compelling anymore. Suddenly it doesn't do anything. And so I think like that core conceit of understanding the difference between an active and a passive experience is one of the core things that people haven't quite unlocked yet. And, you know, I think that we're getting close. You know, we're getting to the point where I think that there's going to be a great one soon.
So, you know, he's saying some of the things that you're saying here, Dan, about, you know, it being a generational thing, that some of these older directors making these movies, you know, probably have never played video games. Do you think it's going to take someone that is a hardcore fan of...
No.
No?
I don't. The perfect situation for me, I mean, it can, but we've certainly seen hardcore fans make adaptations and them not turn out to be as successful as they would want. I think that the Star Trek, the JJ Star Trek scenario is the perfect scenario. Not that it has to be that, but I love that was a mix of people that really adored the source material and then someone at the helm who had a fondness but not a deep adoration, and was able to tap into what people admired about that source material, but also was able to tap into an experience and provide an experience that was exciting whether you cared about that source material or not. I think a lot of the bad video game adaptations, for as much as we criticize, like, oh, they just didn't understand, the studio didn't understand, and whatever, if you think about it, a lot of them were too literal with the source material. I think all the Street Fighters treated ridiculous things as, you know, sacred. Mortal Kombat is certainly that way. I mean, all of them applied the more silly attributes of the game to the cinematic experience, and I don't think that is required. I think we've yet to see someone who understands what works about the game and respects the game, but could make something that's different and succeeds on its own. I haven't seen. I never read Ready Player One, but it sounded like I was listening to either you guys on your daily or the main Slash Filmcast discussing it, and apparently it was quite different from the book. And I don't think anyone cares. If something is great, it really doesn't matter how much or how little it relates to the source material. People only criticize how poorly different it is from the book, or how much better it is from the book, or not how much better, but if people only criticize something for not being, for taking too many liberties with the book if the movie sucks. If it's great, it doesn't matter. And we just have yet to have something that's that great in a video game movie.
I want to ask Jacob, do you think it is possible to adapt an active experience for a passive? Like, is it possible to take that 20-hour storyline in the video game and beat it with a 2-hour movie?
That's where I start wondering what people want out of video game experience they want translated. Like, for example, I'll talk about two of my favorite games of all time and why they're so wildly different. One of them is Red Dead Redemption, which is an open-world Western game where you wander around being a cowboy, going on missions, getting gunfights, exploring, but it's very, very narrative-driven. You are playing to see what these characters do next. You are playing to see where the plot goes, and it is possible to imagine that storyline being adapted into a movie because the characters exist in a place where you can strip away all the wandering and all the mini games and all the collecting, all the little things that complete the experience, and you still have a story that makes sense, a story that has characters you love, and goes in places that are moving and surprising. I still think that game has one of the best endings I've ever seen in any medium, video game, movie, comic, anything. Compared to something like Bloodborne or Dark Souls, games that are intentionally light in story, games that hide their narrative intentionally and obscure them, and you have to go watch YouTube videos or read in the lore or read item descriptions to piece together what is going on, because the point of that game is not to follow a character. The point of that game is to explore and be lost in a tone, to be lost in an atmosphere, and to understand the game's mechanics to the point where you're professional at it, to the point where you understand these levels and these enemies like they're your family. There are areas in those games where I can walk you through them blindfolded. I can tell you where to go because I the game taught me so well how to understand how it functions as a gameplay experience. So they're so different. And like, for example, you could take Red Dead Redemption and make it into a movie, and it would function. But if you want to make a Dark Souls or a Bloodborne game, you'd have to tack on a story. You'd have to say, you wouldn't be able to translate what makes that game fun for people. That is an unadaptable experience. It is something that is unique to the video game medium, whereas Red Dead is borrowing liberally from film, intentionally. It is homaging famous Westerns constantly. These other games, I even include Super Mario Brothers in this conversation. They're games that say, what are the strengths of this medium? How do we play those strengths and ignore cinema altogether? So there's all these video games that are active experiences in that they were not built with movies in mind whatsoever, whereas other games happily wear cinema on their sleeves. So I guess the short answer to your question, Peter, is the active experience depends on what kind of active experience. Is it an active experience working toward a story, or is it one that's built around gameplay? And if it's the former, if it's Mass Effect, or if it's Red Dead Redemption, then yeah, I think there's a movie there. I think you got to find the right way to approach it. I think Warcraft proved that being a fan doesn't mean you can make a great movie. But there are other games where I think it's literally unadaptable. It's just like saying, I'm going to adapt this painting. No, you can't make this painting into a movie. This painting was made to be observed and appreciated in this way, in this room, in this particular atmosphere. So I think it's a matter of picking and choosing, honestly.
So I have a couple responses to that, if I may, Peter. Yeah. Well, firstly, I should say those are also my favorite games of all time. Red Dead Redemption, I agree, is the best ending of any in any medium, and Dark Souls and its sequels are my favorite games. So worth noting that. The interesting thing about Red Dead, as I was thinking about it before having this conversation with you guys, is that I think that's indicative of some of the other pitfalls of adapting video games, which is a lot of games are copying cinematic experiences already. And I think the things that we love about Red Dead, aside from the gameplay experiences, are when they, and I say this about a lot of video games that I don't want to call out by name. But
I will call them out. Like, so Uncharted is Indiana Jones meets Die Hard, right?
I wasn't even going to bring it up in that way. What I was going to say was, I think the moments that we find incredibly, we are moved by the writing, and the storytelling moments. I think we appreciate them so much. We put them on a pedestal because they are so similar to the cinematic experiences we have. And prior to those games have fallen short and have really felt like poor writing. But I don't know that Red Dead is better than any Western movie. It just is as good as and quite similar to the Western movies I've seen. The things that make it excellent and transcendent are the fact that I am traveling, I'm holding a controller and moving. I get off on a train station and I get on a horse and I spend 5 minutes going across the country. It's time that I would not spend in a movie. Unless it's, Terrence Malick or perhaps P.T. Anderson sometimes, but 20 minutes riding on my horse, encountering different things, and then finally getting to my homestead. And really, finally, for me, that game gave me this understanding of, more than a movie has, of what life was like in that time period, because you really feel the space. And you really feel the, wow, you are on your own and have to hunt. And the ending that I don't want to spoil for anyone, but I think it's so powerful because you are in control. And I think in a movie, we've seen those beats played out in movies before. That said, there's also, I'll speak out the other side of my mouth when I say, if 3:10 to Yuma, which is a more recent Western that I quite enjoyed, if that was called Red Dead Redemption and was the Red Dead Redemption adaptation, it'd be great. I loved it. It was well reviewed, I think. And that could have been the movie that broke the video game curse. I think to go down this tangent, if Raiders of the Lost Ark was the Pitfall movie, I know that the timing doesn't map out there, but let's just say, hypothetically, it's the same movie. It's the exact same movie. It just has a different title, and it was called, it could have been Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, such a Pitfall movie, whatever it is. And same movie, then that would have been the movie that broke the game curse. So it's worth noting that, we have yet that not having the great movie it could be based on the source material. There's a version where you're very allegiant to the source material, and there's a version where you use it as a jumping off point. And I think that's what a Dark Souls movie would probably have to be. I've not seen The Witch. I hear it's great, and my sense of that movie is that if that were not set in that time period, but that were set in a medieval gothic horror situation and label it Dark Souls, same filmmaker and same aesthetic and same drive, then perhaps that would have been a way that you handle Dark Souls and something that did not have to provide the same experience that the game provides, which is very meta and something that I enjoy, but it takes the tone, it draws on other things. And I think that we've seen a lot of success in other adaptations, be it from books or articles or biopics, where the authors have taken a lot of liberties in how they're telling the story, and when they're great, we don't care. I know I've mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning in this new context.
I have a question for you, Dan, but following up on that, because now I'm imagining a Robert Eggers directed Dark Souls.
Right.
I'm like, it's making me very happy because I love The Witch, and I feel like his sense of doom that pervades every single frame of that movie is perfect for Dark Souls. Like when you put on Dark Souls, when I play Dark Souls, I get scared. I'm scared every time I'm playing it. Same with Bloodborne, which I prefer actually. So I feel like there's a tone thing here. Like, yeah, the tone is right, but I feel like, is there a way for a movie to capture the spirit of actually playing that game, where the idea being you're going to die 1,000 times but master it? Is there any way for a movie to adapt not only a game's feeling, which is not easy, but it's possible to imagine, but is there a way for a film to adapt the process of how it feels to actually play a game and achieve that satisfaction? I ask because I'm also thinking of Edge of Tomorrow, which for me reflects the idea, what a game feels like. My movie feels like playing a video game and how it feels to actually master a game.
That's what I was going to. Yeah. I was just going to say.
Or even source code.
Right. It's first of all, I don't think you have to for there to be the good adaptation of that game. But B, yes, yeah, you would just do a Groundhog Day thing. Or, I often thought about adapting that material there's something interesting. You know what? I'm not going to say. This is not the forum for me to describe it. But I think there's just a few ways that you could find a way into that also tap into being a kind of story that we have not seen, and that is worth noting, that statement, because a lot of the video game adaptations we've seen so far in movies have been, this is like this kind of movie, so let's adapt it. And what would really break through is tapping into this would provide a cinematic experience unlike one we've had before. And that I think is certainly what I've been searching for. I would love to adapt a movie at some point, adapt a video game at some point, but I'm less interested in, as I mentioned previously, like a movie that I'd either have to trace the game because the game is already very cinematic and does it so well, but on top of that, it can only pale in comparison to the game's experience. So I think Jordan, certainly him doing Metal Gear Solid is very interesting because that is an insane game, and there are aspects to that game that are very traditional, and there are aspects of that game that are bizarre. And I think Jordan has a sensibility that fits that very well, and that certainly could provide an experience that could be the one to break through.
I'm wondering, and I want to go to HT for this. Like, do you think, most video games are told from a first-person perspective, and even third-person games, like you are still kind of playing that person and develop the game and the story. I think leaves it up to you to kind of create that person. I know there are video games, obviously, like Uncharted and Tomb Raider, which have an iconic hero. But do you think, HT, do you think that's what might be missing from these video game adaptations? That much of the character is kind of left to the player?
That's an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure if that's a sort of a choice that would be suited towards movies, towards cinema. I think that's something that's explicitly for video games and that you can't really translate to movies. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying about the passive versus the active experience. I think that's where the dividing line is for video games versus for movies. And like movies, we have characters who are sort of like a blank slate for the audience that you can sort of project yourself onto, like The Matrix, for example, which has sort of some roots in video games as well. But I don't know if that's something that you can really bring straight from the video game experience, unless you're doing like a VR movie or something like Hardcore Henry. So yeah, that would be, I don't know if that would ever be possible in a movie, like a traditional movie.
It's interesting that you referenced The Matrix, actually, because I was sitting here and thinking, first of all, most of the game adaptations so far have not been based on first-person video games and have been based on games that have characters to a fault. I think Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter have insane characters, and they unfortunately decided to put all of them in the movie and take them all literally, and And I think Tomb Raider is a great protagonist, a potentially great protagonist, and it sounds like people responded to her especially in that movie. I think, though interestingly, certainly movies do have quite often, and I think The Matrix is an example of a movie with a protagonist that is very much an analog, or not an analog, a vessel for the audience, and is not that rich themselves. And is really there to usher us along the story. And Neo, I think, is a perfect example of, describe Neo. Who is that guy? He's a hacker. He's what's his personality? But yet he's a famous, iconic character because of what he gets to do and becomes and all that. And that's not much unlike a lot of first-person video game experiences, But I think that the games that have transcended have been mostly games that are third person, and then I think that's what creates a stronger bond. Why we've enjoyed those games so much more is because we're really connected to the behaviors that we're seeing and who we're controlling, which is just storytelling. That's pure storytelling.
So I don't know. It seems like you're making this argument for a video game adaptation to be so loosely based on the video game that it could just be an original property in itself, but Hollywood use the video game as a name brand.
No, I think that's my preference for all adaptation. That it shouldn't be made because the thing is a success. And because it already works in this medium, that it should be made because even if it weren't based on something, it's such a great idea, it's such a great premise, or it's such a great character or a set of circumstances, whatever the hook is, that, oh my God, we have to make this thing. And a lot of the adaptations so far have not been based on things that provide for that. They are like, how could we pull this off? And then they backtrack it from there into something that resembles a 3-act structure and what have you. And I think far more exciting is to dig into, well, how could this be, even if it wasn't based on this, why would it still be awesome? And it's worth noting that, shoot, what was I going to say? I don't know. Go to the next thing and then I'll remember. My mind just blanked.
Well,
yeah.
I did want to mention, Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle, which I know isn't like a great movie. But I was surprised that this is the first movie that we've gotten that kind of like played with the video game tropes of, going into a video game, having cutscenes.
Actually, I want to disagree with that because there have been movies like Scott Pilgrim versus the World that play into sort of that video game experience. Edge of Tomorrow, like we talked about too. Yeah, and it's kind of like, it's interesting to me because like those movies really appeal to me because they're structured like a video game, but they don't have anything to do with a previous video game at all.
There's also Brain Scan and Lawnmower Man and Freddy's Dead. I think it was Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare had that 8-bit. Oh, The Beach had another 8-bit. Tender sequence. And I know we know what you meant, Peter. But worth noting.
Yeah, what I'm talking about though, I feel like is it's weird that it took this long to have a movie that kind of takes place inside a video game, even if it isn't based on a video game. And I know there are stories that take place inside video games, but not using the tropes of those games, like the what do you call those characters so they're controlled by the computer? NPCs, yeah. See, this shows how little I play video games. But it's stuff like that. Like I've never seen that in a movie, and it's interesting. Going back to your point of video games have been around since like the late 70s, early 80s, and it's taken almost 40 years to get to the point that we're like having a story explore that. But I wanted to ask you guys what video game do you think could actually break the video game curse?
Go ahead, guys.
No one has one.
While everybody thinks, I want to respond to what Peter just said, which is that HBO's Westworld does an amazing job of playing with video game tropes, because when guests arrive in the robot theme park in that show, they're immediately surrounded by NPC robots who are quest givers saying, hey, I need help with this. Or, hey, you want a job? Come over here. And anybody who's played Skyrim or open world RPGs will recognize that, this is a live action recreation of what it's like to wander into a town in one of these games. So I think that there are other shows that maybe not be that are based on video games, but are borrowing that language in ways that are really interesting if you know what they're doing.
But even Westworld is something that came out last year. Like, I feel like we're only scratching the surface. And maybe it is because, we're now have a generation of people that grew up with video games, like Jordan said, now creating this content. But yeah, let's get back to the question. HT, do you have a video game that could break the video game curse?
Well, this is not a video game I played, but I know a lot of people want a Last of Us adaptation, just because the story itself is so cinematic, and it's a story we're actually all kind of familiar with. Like it's post-apocalyptic, older sort of weary man takes on a young girl under his wing, and they travel the world and survive. So it's something we've seen in like Logan, for example, other movies. So I think people are really...
Here's my question with that. Like, I know I've only played a little bit of Last of Us, and I've had arguments with Dan about Last of Us. But if you aren't controlling that character and making the decisions that lead to these emotional moments that people really value about a game like that, would it be a good movie watching it passively?
Yes.
It would?
Yes.
Why wouldn't it? I mean, do you not? Is The Road? How do you feel about The Road? I mean, actually, it doesn't matter to you personally,
but...
right? But it answers that question. Or The Walking Dead. I mean, you passively they're really instant choices that characters have to make. Sorry.
But you don't think that game, the enjoyment of that game is benefits from the active experience that you are actually making?
It 100% does. It 100% does. Just the way that a book benefits from allowing you to use your imagination when you're envisioning what these people look like and what they're doing. It totally benefits from it. But that doesn't mean that it stamps out the ability for an adaptation in another medium to be awesome in its own way,
Yeah, I feel like Last of Us is a really good example of a Red Dead type game where the narrative is the key driving point here, because while the gameplay in Last of Us is good, it is very much on rails in a good way. It's always pushing you toward the story, even though you have the illusion of a decision. Like, do I go this way? Do I go that way? Do I hide or do I shoot? Do I use this weapon or that one? Ultimately, you are still going in the same direction. Your characters make the same decisions, and ultimately it is like playing a long movie. So I feel like if the filmmaker could capture the tone of the action and the tone of that suspense and hit those beats as they lead you to beat by beat in the game, it's totally adaptable.
Yeah. I'm not saying adaptable, but like if I were to watch online, if I were to watch online a video of someone completing Last of Us, would I think it is as great of an entertainment watching it passively as you did playing it actively?
I don't. I think there's a chance. That's a totally different question. The answer to that, I feel, is that there's a chance that you could enjoy watching someone. I mean, my wife watched me play that game and got a degree of enjoyment out of it. However, it's definitely not the same. I think play any horror game that has lots of scares in it. Watching someone play it is far less scary than when the controller's in your hand, because there's a real tacit agreement between the player and the game that that at any moment the way you push that controller, something bad could happen, and there's a responsibility there, and there's a tension there that's not there if you're just watching someone make those choices.
Okay, that's exactly what I wanted to get to. Yeah, how do you adapt that for the screen?
It's already been adapted. We have tons of horror movies filled with jump scares and frights aplenty. That experience, we've had that. And it can be a personal preference whether you enjoy watching a horror movie or playing a horror game. I find horror games, I'm over it now. I get too scared and I realize it's not fun, and I realized I can choose to not play a game. No one's forcing me. I put the controller down. There's a great Alien Isolation that came out that everyone was raving about. I have not played it. I'm never going to play it. And yet I just watched Alien Covenant the other day. You know, like those are two different degrees of experience, but it doesn't mean that you can't adapt that experience. I mean, that has occurred. In fact, the game is an adaptation. And this is the thing that I was saying when we started, is the game is already an adaptation of a cinematic experience. There are very few games, and those happen to be my favorites, that aren't even going for an adaptation of that kind. Like games like Journey or Limbo or Braid or Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons are incredible because of the way that they function as a game. But I also think that they could be adapted, certainly. I think the final thing I would say, which is sort of the ender of all conversations, not even just video games, is the Lego Movie. You know, and now that exists, we have that to point to. But before it existed, it was still true, even though we didn't have it to point to. But that just proves that you really can adapt anything, and you can be as allegiant to the spirit of it, or you could be allegiant to literal things about it, or throw it all away and be doing your own thing. It doesn't matter. There's a way in to anything. It just has to be found, and has to be the right way in. And the Marvel movies are another version of that, where there are poor versions of any of those characters being portrayed on screen, but they've happened to tap the vein in so many times of the right way to tell that kind of story. There certainly would have been there's a bad version of Guardians of the Galaxy out there. You know, there's a version where that zany material could not have been handled right, and it would have been a big turnoff, and it wouldn't have worked. But they found a way to make that work. As ridiculous as and those characters, a tree and a talking raccoon, could have been characters straight from Street Fighter. You know, as ridiculous as those characters are.
Yeah.
But they found the right concoction to make it work, and I think we need a few more at-bats. And I also think the video game curse is going to be broken for TV. I have this suspicion that.
I feel like TV is probably a better medium to adapt a video game. Like, I would like to see a Red Dead TV series more than I would like to see a Red Dead movie. Right.
But this is just to my earlier point. There's that show Hell on Wheels that I haven't really watched, but that could be Red. I mean, there's nothing stopping that from just being called Red Dead, and that could already exist and already be a success. And so that's. To me, it's so ripe to happen, but I also know that you would not like a Red Dead TV series because you don't like westerns. But,
probably. But I like Westworld, so I don't know. Yes. Jacob, you've had enough time to think about this. What video game do you think could break the video game movie curse?
I'm going to go with an answer that's complete opposite of HT's in every way. I'm going to go with XCOM, the strategy series about government agents fighting aliens in secret. And I'll tell you why. There is no direct story in XCOM. It's really bare bones. Aliens arrive on Earth. You fight them. You send your soldiers out. Some of them die. You collect resources, you build things, you build your base, you run your bureaucracy, you fight battles. And what's special about this game, and why it's one of my favorite games of all time, especially the new ones, XCOM Enemy Unknown and XCOM 2, is that the drama is all organic. There's no scripted moment where your main character dies or has a heroic moment or a hilarious moment. The game is built on hidden dice rolls and built on you making poor decisions or great decisions. So you go into a fight, and the guy you've been with since mission 1, your main guy, kicks ass, or he dies heroically, or he dies embarrassingly. And I feel like you put 2 writers in front of XCOM for a couple dozen hours, and they took notes of all the ironic and horrible and hilarious and amazing and powerful things that happen by accident, that this game engine offers you the ability to create just organically. You have a smorgasbord of amazing moments to choose from, and you have this basic hooky outline, aliens versus humans, but then you have this collection of personal experiences that you can draw from and put yourself into as a storyteller, as opposed to having to follow somebody else's story. And I think that plays to Dan's point of taking a tone and taking the general idea instead of having to follow things directly. I feel like there's such a powerful platform there for creating something that's personal and unique, as opposed to trying to adhere to what people think XCOM is, because the XCOM is, to you, something very different than what it would be to HT or Peter or Dan.
It's interesting that you say XCOM, because that's actually a property that I've thought I would love to adapt, because but for me the attractive bit.
Now that you said that, Dan, someone's going to run a story. Dan Trachtenberg wants.
I think I've attempted. I feel like I've tried to figure this out already, but so I don't know if it's doable. But I always love the idea of having an X-Files kind of show, but serialized and set in the 1960s with it's more like they had that attempt to be a third person, the Bureau or whatever. But I remember those commercials being really, really cool. But having sort of future 1960s concepts of what future tech would be like, and doing that, a premise that we've seen before, but period, in the way that Stranger Things is succeeding by placing it in period. I feel like, I hate using the word succeeding, but what's cool about that show is that things that we've been seeing in modern superhero movies are happening in the 1980s. Also, it's evoking all the stuff that we loved in those. But anyway, not to go down that rabbit hole. But anyway, XCOM, I think it could be actually really cool, and I think would be great for TV, actually. Yeah.
I don't currently play video games, as you know. I've said it 100 times in this podcast. But a game I've been hearing about a lot recently that I actually think could be a good movie is Fortnite Battle Royale. I feel like that battle. It's kind of like Hunger Games or Battle Royale. Yeah. So it would be. It just seems like so many people are playing that. They have millions of people playing it online at the same time right now, or something insane. It is a brand name that people would come to. It doesn't have any characters. It really just has the small gem of an idea that could be pulled off on a scale from either, Blumhouse. It could be done in a, very low budget thing to a big epic, $200 million movie. You could do
We've already had that movie.
What movie?
Hunger Games.
Yeah, but
and Battle Royale.
The actual games in Hunger Games are actually just such a small part of that movie, I feel like. And I feel like I would like to see a survival, a movie where it starts with the person, correct me if I'm wrong, they're parachuting down at the beginning of the game. Yeah, I know vague information about this. It just starts like that, kind of like the movie Predators with...
Right. Yep.
Yeah. It just starts us in the action, and the whole movie is just that game. Do you know what I mean? Us following someone in that game. Maybe there's not enough story there, but
the interesting thing is that Fortnite is a really, it's got a Pixar aesthetic. So the interesting thing would be to take this really dark premise and applying that kind of aesthetic to it, and seeing that there seems to be an interesting chemistry there.
Yeah.
But I feel like everything you just said is exactly
Well, you would also have like everybody has like these things that can create like these colorful like buildings and stuff, right? Like, isn't that how Fortnite works? Like,
that's what's unique to Fortnite as opposed to the other battle royale games. Yes,
yeah, I feel like that could make a cool movie, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Your premise was one that I feel was the issue with the adaptations prior. Was that there's 1 million people playing this game right now, and it's
well,
similar.
That's not my premise. I'm just saying my premise is that like you could use that as a brand to get people in, and
but that doesn't matter. That's the last reason to make a video game movie. As Jacob mentioned, Warcraft not being the success that it should have been, and there are more people playing that game than any game, especially overseas. It doesn't matter if the millions of people played the game, all showed up and bought tickets. If every single one of them bought tickets, you would not have a success. You need so much more than that. So that's never the reason to do it. And this is with any comic book, anything. Just because there's a fan base there.
I want to be clear. The reason why I'm pitching this is not because there's a fan base, but because I like the battle royale idea. I liked it when I first saw it in what was that Japanese movie or.
Battle Royale,
yeah. Battle
Royale. I've liked it since then. Actually, even before that, there was that reality show movie.
Yeah, Series 7, The Contenders.
Series 7, The Contenders is bad, but I love it.
Yeah.
Running Man. Yeah, Running Man too. Yeah, I love that premise, and I like the idea of like having this futuristic device that can like build things like in real time in front of you. I think that could be cool. But
that you're right. There is an angle there with that, like theoretically.
So Dan, it's up to you. What video game could break the video game movie curse?
I'll just speak generally. The thing, it potentially could be Uncharted because it's so great, and from what I've heard of the take, it could be cool. Could be different than Tomb Raider, and then they're really going to tell a different story. But tell it with the same tone and all that. I think that could potentially do something. But for me, I think there's the spirit of the Lego movie, the taking a property that nobody. Frankly, one of the things that propelled me, to make that Portal short, was that nobody was looking at that as a cinematic concept. I made that in a time that there were a lot of shorts with aliens and robots and stuff that were coming out, and video game adaptations were the announced ones were all the big properties and Halo and all the stuff that is based on cinematic concepts. And Portal is not based on cinematic concepts, and that was the exciting thing for me, was to prove that you could take this thing that is viewed one way as a puzzle game, right? It's inherently uncinematic. It's a puzzle game. It's not a story. Actually, the story in the game happens to be brilliant. But on the face of it, the mechanics of it do not lend themselves to playing out on a big screen. And that sounds silly now, but at the time, that certainly was the way that it felt, and that was what was exciting, was to interpret the game the way that I did. So that would be the thing that I'd still chase, is like, what's the game that nobody's thinking of?
So you're saying Minecraft the movie?
Well, that is
the thing. Yeah,
that is the script. Yeah, that is a so not Minecraft, but I think Minecraft, by the way, would probably lend itself more to being a lot like the Lego movie.
By the way, after Lego movie, there's like a whole genre of movies being adapted. Like there's a Play-Doh movie that they're working on.
Right.
Like, it's crazy, the kind of things that I don't think would have existed before the Lego movie.
Totally. By the way,
I think that this kind of started back when they adapted a theme park ride into a 5-movie franchise with Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah. And by the way, that movie was great.
And it's really good.
Yeah, totally. And that, of course, that for me, it's like that broke the theme park ride curse. But no, was there a theme park adapted before? Was there a ride adapted before that movie?
Haunted Mansion with Eddie Murphy was horrible.
Right.
So that was after Pirates, though. I think the only theme park adaptation before that was the direct-to-video Twilight Zone Tower of Terror movie.
Yeah, which Peter owns. I think
I do.
I think if we had had a bunch of crappy before Pirates of the Caribbean, if we had a bad Haunted Mansion movie and a bad Jungle Cruise movie and a bad, all those things, and then Pirates came out, that would have been the one to break the curse. We'd have been applauding, and it wouldn't have been because the rides changed themselves. The rides themselves changed. It would have been because they finally found the right concoction. And talent and all that stuff. And we haven't had that genre on screen since that. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, it's Johnny Depp's performance. And when was the last great pirate movie? And I don't know if Master Commander came before it, but that's a totally different thing. But we really hadn't. It would have been Cutthroat Island. So I think that there's another secret sauce to that. And I would point to that for video games is what is a genre. What video game is an entry into a genre that we haven't had on screen in a long time? I think that would be the right avenue to pursue.
My last question was my last question, but I do have one last question, and that is, it seems like a lot of video games are inspired by cinema. We mentioned before Nathan Drake being kind of largely inspired by Indiana Jones and maybe like the smart-assness of like John McClane or something like that. Do you think that part of it is that we still haven't reached a peak originality from video games, that like I think we're starting to see a lot of video game stories that are now not like as inspired by cinema as.
That's really interesting because I think that Super Mario is as original as you can get. It's so unconnected from movies. You look at Super Mario Odyssey, the most recent one, and there's absolutely no cinema in there. Everything about that game is pure video game. The question is, how do you take that experience and put it to the big screen? I don't know how you do that. I think that video games for years have had their own language. They've been completely divorced from cinema, and only maybe the past 15 years, maybe 20 years, have video games started to follow cinematic beats. So I think that it starts the conversation I hinted at earlier. Is it a video game meant to be experienced in a video game, or like in that format, in that zone, or is it a thing that's meant to be more of a narrative experience? So I hope that answers your question. I don't know if it does.
I don't think it does.
Peter, go ahead. Sorry.
I think what I'm saying is Nathan Drake seems inspired by Indiana Jones, which is inspired by old serials, and it feels kind of like a third generation, even though there's some uniqueness and some greatness in how the Uncharted video games do those kind of like the action and stuff. Like, I'm not saying that it is just a copy of a copy of a copy, but Dan, do you think that's part of the trouble with some of these video game franchises, that they're kind of like so inspired by cinema?
Yeah, I mean, partly. I think it's certainly a hurdle, which is how I started this table setting is that. But I think there's lots of really unique video games, but what you're saying is the games that are cinematic of that ilk. Has there been a game that's tapped into a unique story premise?
Oh, and I'm not saying there isn't. I'm just saying I feel like we're in the dawn of video games still. Like, it's still very early on. Like, that first generation of video games was like Mario, and were like these very like abstract kind of things. And then we got into like these cinematic things that were inspired by movies. And now we're getting things which I think are partially not inspired, that are more unique on their own. I'm not saying that there hasn't been that, but like
right. Yeah, but I mean, I just have to point to what we just said about Pirates of the Caribbean, and we're not. You keep trying to assign a reason why the medium has not worked, and what I think my whole thesis is, there's nothing about the medium that is causing the problem. It's just that it hasn't happened yet. Because you could say the same thing for board games, and Clue was great. You could say the same thing for theme parks. There's nothing about it, but yet we've had that great movie. It's just there are certainly things that are inherent to all those mediums that are not direct storytelling experiences, or that did not originate as storytelling experiences.
But I don't think we've had as many. I don't think there's any medium that has provided so many adaptations that have not been good. Does that make sense?
Like I said before, there's just been less at bats. We've had a bunch. I agree. We've had a lot of crappy ones. We're talking about this for a reason, because we say there's this video game curse. But we could have been. Like I was saying before, there could have been a comic book curse.
But you really think that there's no reason for it? It just hasn't happened. Like, it's not. Like...
I think there are these. So not just being generous. I think there are lots of reasons, of which we talked about many today. Those are reasons why it's been challenging so far. But I don't think any of those reasons totally block the ability. I don't think we have yet to see the game to come out so that we could have one. I think any of the games that have come out prior could provide us with a great movie. I guess that would be my answer directly to the question you just asked. Is that it's not that we have yet to see the game. It's just that we have yet to tap into the right adaptation. And really, there just have not been that many. There really have not. There's only a few that we haven't mentioned on the show. So, I mean, on this podcast. So, just hasn't happened yet.
HT, do you have any last thoughts on this?
I mean, I see what you're saying, Peter, in that like the more recent video games, which are very cinematic, have this sort of codependent relationship or existence with cinema. And that's why maybe like translating from movies back to video games, back to movies again doesn't quite work. And I know what you're saying by like thinking that the video game structure works in movies that are like original films and that kind of play into that fun video game leveling structure and boss structure and sort of submission structure, and why there's like that disparity. I think that I'm kind of on the same board as Dan in that like maybe there's not the right mixture yet. Like lightning in a bottle hasn't quite struck yet for a successful video game adaptation that either doesn't lean too much into the cinematic inspirations, or that doesn't lean too much into its video game inspirations. It's something that's like completely wholly unique. So maybe that's what we need in a video game adaptation, something that isn't too much inspired or like a pastiche of other things that have come before it.
Yes, totally.
Well, maybe someday, a company like Blizzard will be thought of alongside Marvel at the cinema. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe they will have 10 years of entertainment in these big epic crossover events. I don't see that time happening anytime soon. But
it's worth noting, and I mean it's worth mentioning the Blizzard specifically that their cinematic or division, I don't know how you describe it, but their media division is now run by Stacey Sher, and that she could potentially be. So Stacey Sher was Tarantino's producer for almost all of his movies, if I'm not misspeaking. So that's something that we haven't really had is an incredible producer that we haven't. Movies have not found their Kevin Feige. Blizzard definitely has quite a few properties that are revered for their storytelling. So that could certainly be a concoction. And worth noting, that division was not around prior to Warcraft. The more recent Warcraft movie.
Dan, where can people find your work online?
I believe 10 Cloverfield Lane is out on, I think it's streaming on Amazon, and hopefully
it's
other
on
places.
Amazon.
Yeah, you can totally buy it as well. I guess I should say you should buy it. That'd probably be better for me. It's on Blu-ray. We did a nice 4K HDR transfer of it, and recently, and Black Mirror. My episode of Black Mirror called Playtest is, I believe, labeled season 3 on Netflix. Episode 2 of season 3. It was the first American season for Netflix. And I'm on Twitter at DannyTRS on Twitter.
What's up next for you?
So many balls in the air on that one.
That hesitation is I can't say.
Well, the ink is drying on something that I'm going to be leaping into imminently, and that will be there will be an announcement of that very, very shortly. Cool. That's something. Yeah.
HT, where can people find more of your work?
I'm every day at slashfilm.com, and you can find me on Twitter at Hoai-Tran Bui.
Jacob, where can people find you?
I'm on Slashfilm every single day, and I'm on Twitter at Jacob S. Hall.
You can find me at Slashfilm on Twitter. Slashfilm Daily is published every weekday. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please go rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends, spread the word, and we'll see you tomorrow.